Okay, hello, world politics students. Today we're going to talk about international conflict. And we're going to take a little bit of a different approach than your textbook. So let me call up the slide, get the slideshow going. Your textbook largely bypasses different theories about the outbreak of war, the outbreak of international conflict. And they're not alone in that, the textbook authors. A very famous political scientist, international relations scholar named Kenneth Waltz argued that perhaps wars are like earthquakes in that they're beyond the realm of man to truly fully understand or to predict with any accuracy. That they're natural phenomena and their causes are so complex, we're never really going to be able to drill down and have precise understanding because there's so many different types of causes. That has led some scholars to throw their hands up in the air. I would say your textbook authors do this a little bit. So instead of looking at broader ideas or sets of ideas like theories of what causes war, they just list a bunch of different causes, economic causes, religious differences, ideological differences. And they say all these different types of causes, types of influences can lead to a war, but they're not broader integrated theories. We're going to try to look at just a few ideas of theories just to give you a taste of them at the different levels of analysis. And levels of analysis, it was introduced, it's an idea that was introduced in your introductory chapter, and there are three typically studied. One is the individual level, and these are individual human beings or leaders and how their flaws or foibles lead to conflict or lead to rash action. There's the domestic level, which is phenomena at the state level within the country or characteristics of the country or a set of countries like democracies or autocracies, and how they might lead to countries being more likely to be involved in international conflict. And then there's something, the third level, called the system level, the international system level. And this is about the interaction between those states and how that interaction influences conflict. So we'll start with, and we're just going to look at different ideas at each of these levels to get a sense of these different theories. So we're going to start with the individual level. A common idea is that human aggressiveness might be part of why states, we have this history. If you look back over time, this history of states frequently recurring in a recurring pattern, getting involved in conflict and war. And a historical realist argument is that human nature lies at the root of this, that humans, at the end of the day, we seek status, we seek possessions like territory, and like animals in the wild, will fight and will kill to gain prestige and status and acquire goods. Thomas Hobbes, that famous realist, said that men are inherently competitive and that fear, ambition, and the desire for gain is what ultimately leads to war. So we're going to deal with this individual level very quickly. There's a problem with this. There are a couple problems with this. First problem is more normative. So at the end of the day, we see wars, the type of slaughter we've seen over the past couple centuries. If it's due to human beings being inherently incredibly competitive to the point that they will crush others and wage war in other societies, then we're never going to be able to solve that. This is the normative concern because there are only two ways to solve it. The first way to solve it is to build structures around humans to try to constrain their bad behavior, their bad nature, or to try to, the second way is to change human nature. And we've tried to build um, various institutions and buffers between states over time. And we'll talk about it more later, but um, as we gave the example of the idealist in the interwar period, they don't always perfectly work. We've tried this for a very long time, and we still have conflict. We still have war between states. We haven't had a world war for 50 or 60 years, but we continue to have wars. We have them on the headlines even today. The other issue is if it's all boils down to changing human nature, that's probably not going to be something that's going to be feasible. Whenever we mess and start tampering with human nature, we often have unintended consequences. And man's attempts to better Mother Nature usually end up backfiring in one way or the other. So that's the normative concern. We really can't change this. More importantly, I would argue, is that it's not that great of an explanation. So think about it. Even though humans have this nature, the vast majority of the time we live in peace. The vast majority of the time states live in peace. We're not in some anarchic dog eat dog society. I don't in the evenings drive out at night and run people off the road like Mad Max and loot them because I can, if I could. I mean, but we don't do that. We're peaceful the vast majority of the time. So how do you explain that? People who buy into the human aggressives argue that, well, then it's certain triggers or certain contexts that lead people to be aggressive. Well, then it's not only human nature that's at fault. There are other phenomena and other issues and variables that we need to look at. The basic underlying issue is, so war is a variable phenomena. It doesn't occur all the time. It occurs sometimes. It doesn't occur at other times. But human nature, by definition, is a constant phenomena. It's hard to explain something that occurs irregularly with something that's a constant. So that's just an idea at the individual level, one set of ideas. There are other really interesting individual level theories. There are, and actually has been gaining steam over the past 5-10 years, really interesting studies about leaders and different psychological frameworks, simple categorizations that can help to understand, but seem to give some explanation to why leaders in certain contexts might be more willing, a certain type of personality, to use force than another leader with a different type of personality. But we won't go into those details now. So let's turn to the domestic level. A common idea, a prominent idea at the domestic level, is something called the diversionary theory of war. So this is a book on diversionary war by political scientist Suzette William and Mary. I thought the cover captured what we're going to talk about pretty well. So this is the idea that leaders sometimes, and again, this isn't meant to explain all conflict, but sometimes when a country has domestic problems, when the economy is really suffering, when there are riots or protests on the streets, when there's turmoil within the society, that sometimes leaders scapegoat other countries or find enemies, and that they actually use force abroad, use military force abroad, even starting all-out wars in order to unify the population against this external enemy and to divert popular attention away from whatever the domestic problems are. Again, this is called the diversionary theory of conflict or war. Some call it the scapegoat theory. And there's growing evidence that this occurs. It doesn't occur all the time, but there are episodes when it has occurred. A good example ties into this picture. This man was the leader of the Argentinian military junta in 1982 when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, kicking off the Falklands or Malvinas, the Argentinian name for the island grouping, war between Britain and Argentina. The argument is there's no reason this Argentinian leader or his leading group, his coterie of leaders, his winning coalition of leaders, should have launched a war at the time that they did. It made no sense. They had an order of French Mirage planes coming if they had waited just a few more months. The South American winter was coming, which would have made it much more difficult for Britain to respond in terms of sending a fleet, an armada, basically down there to try to retake the islands after the Argentinians invaded. There are all sorts of strategic and military reasons why they should not have done what they did at the time that they did it. It was just not wise. The argument is this government was teetering. They were facing massive protests throughout the country. The economy was sinking rapidly, sparking these protests, and they felt they had to find some kind of external enemy to rally the population in some kind of nationalistic cause. And the fact that Britain controlled these islands off the coast of Argentina for all this time, for a very long period of time, for over a century, gave them the perfect opportunity to try to mobilize popular opinion. And this is a public demonstration or public demonstration of support after the invasion, this picture. People also argue the whole reason Britain responded and sent a fleet and retook the Falkland Islands was because of domestic pressures within Britain. At that time, the leader of the UK was a woman named Margaret Thatcher. She became known as the Iron Lady after the Falklands War. But prior to her response, she was incredibly unpopular. The British economy was in dire straits. She implemented, at the time, what were seen to be fairly radical economic reforms. They were not producing positive results. The economy was struggling. They would produce positive results in a few years. She was seen as cold and harsh because some of these reforms led some to be left behind in society. She was seen as cold from her previous time in government. She'd been education secretary, and she had dramatically reduced support for milk in school lunches. So she was known as Thatcher the Milk Snatcher. But she was just very unpopular. And so this international threat, this violation of British sovereignty, and these are British citizens on the Falkland Islands, not many, but they're British citizens, provided her an opportunity to respond. Why would she respond and send a fleet so far away from Britain? And given the fact that the British had already previously discussed internationally starting to let go of some of their previous holdings around the world and to allow those to be reintegrated within local or nearby countries. Why would she do this? Why would she risk British lives for literally a handful of citizens and a lot of sheep? Um, and an attempt, which is a difficult attempt, to transport troops all this way and have a successful military mission against a local nearby military power by the standards of the region. Um, the argument is the only reason she did it was because of um, domestic pressures, that this was a diversionary action by her to rally the population around her leadership. Um, some argue that the diversionary theory, that really, in some ways, it may not make sense all the time, because if you're facing domestic problems and have domestic unrest, maybe the better solution is to not get involved in foreign issues or foreign conflict, and to spend your attention and devote your resources to your population to solve whatever crisis is occurring at home. Some argue this is part of the explanation for the United States' eventual getting out of the Vietnam War, given the tumult of the era, the protests, the economy was struggling, that this was part of the calculation and decision making to withdraw US forces from Vietnam by the Nixon administration. There's a strong argument that that's why Russia got out of the First World War, especially obviously after the Tsar fell. I mean, they fell in the midst of civil war, but even while the Tsar was still clinging to power, there was a call to return home to solve some of the issues domestically within the country. There's another argument to this, another side to this, that sometimes when countries are struggling internally, their neighbors take advantage of them. And scholars have, in a tongue-in-cheek way, called this the kick them when they're down theory. That when you're struggling and having strife within your country, it might be an opportunity for a historic enemy to take advantage and to try to weaken you even further. Classic example is Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran in 1980. I mean, there's very clear evidence the reason he did this was because Iran was at the beginning stages of the Islamic Revolution, where a US ally, the Shah, was ousted. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who would take power and lead the revolution, came from France, exiled in France, and helped to lead this transition to an Islamic republic in Iran. And Iraq and Iran had historic issues over their border and other issues. Ethnic divisions play a role in this as well. Sunni and Shiite divisions within the Arab world. And Saddam saw that in the midst of this revolution, his historic enemy, which had been armed historically by the United States, the Shah had been a close ally of the United States, now had weaponry where they were cut off from supplies from the US after the revolution. They couldn't get spare parts for their mechanized weaponry. They couldn't get new supplies of weaponry that integrated with what they had. The country was experiencing grave difficulties, so he invaded. He did not succeed and ended up being a 10-year-long bloody struggle, but he did it when he sensed weakness. There was blood in the water. We don't know for sure how many times internal problems lead to external conflict. There's more and more evidence of individual cases where that seems to be a prominent cause of what occurred. But in terms of the overall percentage or the number, we just don't have a sense of how often this occurs. But I will say US foreign policy and other countries' foreign policy, US foreign policy after the Second World War has largely been driven in many areas on this premise that internal issues lead to external conflict. That's why we had Marshall Plan aid to Europe to try to stabilize those countries after years of, well, centuries of fighting on the continent. That's why we had Alliance for Progress aid to South America in the 60s. It's one of the reasons we expanded NATO. We pushed to expand NATO at the end of the Cold War. The idea was to provide some stability to these countries so that they could transition to democracy, stabilize their economies. They would have external security through NATO, but this internal stability, the opportunity to provide internal stability, would help to ensure peace in the future on the continent. So diversionary theory, or its antithesis, kick them when they're down theory. There's another theory, moving to the system level, that has some scholars worried, has some people in key decision-making positions across the world, or especially in the US, thinking about what is going to transpire in our lifetimes, your lifetime, my lifetime. That's something called power transition theory. The notion is, this is the system level, the notion is when powerful countries experience transitions in power, one's declining, is not as powerful as they used to be, the other one's increasing in power and status, military might, and the world. And they cross paths that leads to increasing instability. It increases the odds dramatically that war will break out. Whenever they approach rough equality in power, there's the possibility for tension, for fear of the other, heightened awareness of the other, and apprehension that could lead to conflict. These theories all argue that it's typically the rising country that initiates the war. They kind of envision it like a rear-end collision in a car, with the rising country catching up to the declining country. In this case, the rising country, unfortunately, is kind of like, and I'm sure you don't remember these cars, but the Ford Pinto, which was notorious for having gas tank issues, so that if there was a rear-end collision, the car would explode. And this woman in this picture took advantage of that, I guess, to ensure that people didn't tailgate her, keep off her rear end of her car, because the car is explosive. Anyway, it's a rear end collision in the car. The rising power catches up. So the intuition about this theory is largely based on some of the actions of Prussia and then Germany at the end of the 19th and through the middle of the 20th century. Whereas a core intuition, it's built on a lot of cases we'll talk about in a sec. As Germany caught up to France, you have the Franco-Prussian War. As they caught up again to France and Britain, you have the First and the Second World War, these transitions, periods where one country is declining and the other is rising, leads to friction, competition, greater chance for conflict. Some scholars have argued that this has occurred repeatedly over time in all sorts of historic transitions. For example, so not only here's Germany rising in the bright fuchsia, I call it, France and Britain declining in pink and green, but there are other examples. Britain and France fought a series of wars, ending in the Napoleonic Wars. as the two countries transitioned in power. Britain and the Netherlands fought a series of wars as they tried to establish global naval dominance and controlling trade with India a couple centuries ago. And there are other examples. But what's important for many of these theories is the take that the rising country has on their position in the world. And these theories tend to break this take that they have, their perspective, into two categories. There are status quo powers, those who buy into the international system as it currently exists, who tend to benefit from it, the trade arrangements that exist, the alliances, any international relations that exist at the time. They buy into that current system, set of rules within the international system. And there are revisionist powers. So revisionist powers don't buy into it. Germany, at the turn of the last century, did not buy into some of the rules of the game that were set up. Say with the League of Nations, we talked about that. But even prior to that, Germany consistently, either the Kaiser or Hitler or Bismarck before the Kaiser, they felt their country's power, military power, industrial might, didn't equate with their status. And Hitler made this very clear in repeated statements, and so did other German leaders, that France and Britain, with these massive colonial empires and this status on the world stage, they were hollow shells. In reality, they didn't have the military capability or the economic capability to really keep up with Germany. And thus, the international system should be changed in a way that favored Germany more, recognized in terms of status and prestige Germany's growing primacy and power on the world stage. But if the rising power is largely a status quo power, then that doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. So the United States, you can see here in this bright red or dark red, surpassed Britain, surpassed France, but it did not lead to conflict. And it's largely because the United States was a status quo power at the time. And they had, in terms of relations with Britain, they had historic ties. We had historic ties. This is a cartoon from 1896 when the two countries were in crisis over borders in Venezuela. And the United States had the Monroe Doctrine, trying to limit British and other influence in the Western Hemisphere. And Britain had historical ties and relations, and it led to tension and a crisis. There were a series of crises between Britain and the United States throughout the 19th century. But they didn't lead, of course, after 1812, they didn't lead to outright war. The argument is the United States benefited from the international system. The international system allowed the United States to grow, but plus there were all sorts of ties between the United States and Britain. There were financial ties, there were trade interests, mutual commercial benefits, social ties, ties of kinship. And that's what this cartoon shows. That the two were at loggerheads in this crisis, but all their all their overlapping interests limited the opportunity of the possibility that they would actually go to war. And they, of course, they didn't go to war because the United States was rising, but it was a status quo power. And that raises questions about today, because, as I'm sure you know, In terms of economic and increasingly military power, China has been growing dramatically over the past few decades, ever since they opened up their economy with Deng Xiaoping to allow more capitalist competition. Their economy has just taken off. Your book and many scholars argue that GDP, total GDP, is probably the best indicator of raw power in the international system. According to the IMF and this Danish bank, but many sources are similar. Really soon, in terms of this basic indicator of power, China is going to surpass the United States. 2030 is not far away. And this has raised concern among scholars, among decision makers. Some scholars go back 10 centuries to Sung China and have traced the rise and decline of either small Chinese empires or world powers, or this is supposed to apply to regional competitors too, say in India and in China, going to war in 1962. The rise and declining between rival states, not allied states that are both status quo seeking, but between rival states consistently has led to conflict and often major power, large scale conflict. So that causes concerns because China and the United States aren't necessarily allies, as you might guess, from even casually following the news. It's raised concern within the government. So this is the US's National Intelligence Council using traditional indicators of power, things like GDP, population, military spending, measures of technology. Again, around 2030, China is surpassing the United States, according to the US intelligence community. So they also added on soft power, which wasn't taken into account in any of the previous studies of rise and decline and of powers and war. But they add soft power in to say maybe this will delay the decline or delay the transition. If you think about education or health, perhaps the type of democratic governance, that perhaps this is respected around the world, and this helps as a form of soft power that helps to extend. But even with these US government estimates, 2040 is not that far away. There's a transition occurring. The question arises of whether it's going to be a peaceful transition. China, for the past few years, until very recently, have argued consistently. The public statement, the mantra put out by Chinese officials was that they planned on a peaceful rise. They understood they were growing in might and they wanted greater recognition of their status in the international system, but their rise would be peaceful. That verbiage is no longer used. And China is taking a pretty hard line on Taiwan or island disputes in the South China Sea. As you know, they're trying to expand their influence with the Belt and Road Initiative, with investment throughout the world, all sorts of different kinds of investments. Their investment in Africa and attempt to acquire minerals is extensive. It has led to setting up a military base in Africa. In Djibouti, actually very near the US and French military base in that Horn of Africa country that allows Chinese naval vessels to traverse the Indian Ocean and travel to Africa to enhance Chinese status and capabilities in those areas. But in terms of the transition, the answer is we just don't really know. Some scholars would argue that level of economic interconnection between the two countries helps to to create peace in a way, say, similar to the US and Britain in the past. There are these ties that prevent any type of conflictual power transition. Others say the presence of nuclear weapons, that their leaders would refrain. There can never be another major power war in that way. We're going to discuss these issues as we move on, but we just don't know. And it's occurring within our lifetime, this transition. And I'll say again, many, many scholars have traced this and say that it's a recurring pattern, that it consistently occurs. So for your sake, and for my sake, and all your relatives' sake, let's keep an eye on this. It's an interesting idea. It probably doesn't capture all the complexity that we see in the world, and the world has changed. So let's hope that relations remain peaceful and that nationalistic tensions can be batted down. So that's 3 different ideas at different levels of analysis, just to give you something beyond your textbook. The ideas of human aggressiveness at the individual level, diversionary theory at the domestic level, and power transition at the systemic level. So thank you very much. Again, keep plowing through, taking your quizzes, keep watching your lectures, keep attending all our synchronous activities, and I will talk to you again soon.